think like a lot of us, what I knew about Eunice Kennedy Shriver was that she founded this amazing organization. And I thought of her then, before my research, as a lovely philanthropist who contributed so much to the country. I had no idea that for all of its power, Special Olympics in many ways is a tiny part of Mrs. Shriver's legacy. This is a woman whose fingerprints are on every piece of legislation for the last 50 years that raised the lot of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, not just in the United States, but around the world. She said to the world, it is time to accept that every person, no matter what their abilities, has human dignity and human rights. And I'm going to devote my life to fighting for that. It didn't begin with intellectual disabilities for Eunice as a professional woman. She began her career fighting for the rights and the dignity of children who had broken the law. She was only 25 years old when she was working for the Attorney General of the United States, denouncing conditions in the Dickensian institutions in which juvenile offenders were held. Doesn't that sound familiar? Because of course, years later, she would take herself into the institutions which warehoused children with intellectual disabilities, and she was equally enraged. In fact, you could say rage and compassion powered this woman's life. She went from championing the cause of juvenile delinquents to fighting for the rights of women in prison. She couldn't believe when she worked at the federal penitentiary for women in West Virginia that infants born to their incarcerated mothers were snatched from their arms and taken away from them. Most of these women were incarcerated for economic crimes. Check kiting, writing a false check gets you bounced into a federal penitentiary? Yes, in 1950, that was true. Her private notes in her workbooks from those years, which I thank again the Shriver children for giving me access to, told the story of a woman who saw social justice as the job of all of us. She went in there with the intention of writing a story, of telling the readers of Reader's Digest what she found there. But look what she did. She did so much more. When she took control of the Kennedy Foundation, the charitable organization the family had set up after Joe Kennedy Jr.'s death in World War II. It was an unfocused charity. Yes, it did give some money to people with intellectual disabilities. Yes, it financed altars at Catholic churches, gave money to the Boys and Girls Club. But under her guidance, it turned its entire focus to research, giving millions of dollars to universities all around the United States to answer the question no one was even asking: what's causing intellectual and developmental disabilities, and how do we help? She went from funding research in genetics, in psychology, research in the law, to actually trying to wrestle the educational system into teaching children with intellectuals, proving to the country that these children not only have a right to a playing field, which we know from Special Olympics, but that they have a right to a seat in a public school classroom. That was not federal law until 1975. It would not have become federal law without Eunice Kennedy Shriver. She spent all of her energy making us aware that when you exclude people, you diminish yourself. When her brother became the president of the United States, she didn't give him an opportunity to take the oath of office before she challenged him. You have to create a panel on mental retardation, the term then in use in 1960, in order that we could study and we could get the best research, because the Little Family Foundation couldn't do it. She wanted the resources of the federal government to do it. And she convinced her brother to create that panel. And I think it says everything about the times and the role of women in the world and Mrs. Shriver's unwillingness to accept the designated role in her family. That she organized that panel. She picked the members of that panel. She set the agenda for every meeting. She traveled around the world doing research about how these issues were handled in other countries. And she was never officially a member of the panel. How is that possible? Well, her job was to be supportive of her brothers, to stay in the background, to be invisible. Not unlike her sister Rosemary. But the role of women is defined by women. And one of the great lessons Eunice Kennedy Shriver told me in researching that book is you don't have to be the president of the United States. You don't have to be a United States senator to change the world. No, she wasn't center stage. But behind the scenes, she was crafting legislation. She was whispering in the ears of congressmen, although whisper might be the wrong word. She was too powerful a voice to ever whisper. And she bent institutions to her will. And think about what that will was. It was on behalf of other people, not herself. She saw that political power could be used as an engine of social change. And you didn't have to have a seat on the floor of the United States Senate to do it. I came away from studying her life feeling kind of lazy. I hadn't accomplished all that much in my life, and no one I knew had. And I think that her relentlessness, her power to persuade, her unwillingness to ever say no when the dignity of another human being was at stake is the lesson I take away from her life. And I hope that we all do. There should be 10 biographies of Eunice Kennedy Shriver. I was honored to be able to write hers. I wish more people would read about her. I wish more people would see this program. We have millions of books about the celebrated brothers in the Kennedy family of that generation, and celebrated they should be. But let's not forget a woman whose energy and passion powered one of the great civil rights movements of the 20th century on behalf of people with intellectual disabilities. Thank you.
Molly, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear your speech about my grandma, because I was always told stories about how she was involved in Special Olympics growing up, and you brought to life the concept of her involvement in the criminal justice system. And I studied the criminal justice system in college and am now working for a nonprofit that works on probation and parole reform. So in addition to my commitment to Special Olympics, I feel a close bond with my grandma through our shared, frustration and outrage with the criminal justice system. And so I wanted to ask you a question about that. So today we're seeing many parallels with conversations in the 1950s and 60s around inclusion and civil rights and human rights. And so I wanted to ask if she were alive today, what do you think she would be doing to advocate for marginalized people in this world?
She'd be raising her voice, for one thing, very loudly. Whether President Trump was in office or President Biden was in office, should be in the Oval Office, telling them what for, and what for on a lot of issues. The thing about Mrs. Shriver that struck me is that she didn't preach so much as she led by her actions. When you think about Camp Shriver, which we saw in that wonderful video, you saw in that video that many of the children swimming in her pool and playing on her basketball court and riding her horses were Black children. This was in 1962, a year before her brother proposed the Civil Rights Act. Think about that. That estate on which those children played was in Maryland, then a segregated state. So she didn't have to preach about desegregation. She lived it in her own home. I think she lived it all through her life. Her commitment to the idea that every life has value extended into lots of issues. Her opposition to abortion, for instance, was not just religious. In fact, she formed common cause with, of all people, the Black Panthers. Why? Because the Black Panthers saw the rise of abortion rights as a genocide for the Black community. It's a controversial position that she took, but one of the things about Mrs. Shriver is her life was consistent. She opposed the death penalty. She opposed abortion. She fought for the rights of the intellectually disabled, for the incarcerated, for teenagers who had run afoul of the law. I don't know anybody in the late 20th century whose consistency on social justice issues is as broad and as deep as Mrs. Shriver.